Good morning, everybody. This is Josh Valentine, Communications Manager with the Clean Coalition. Thanks for joining yet another webinar from the Clean Coalition. This one is our next webinar on the rise of distribution resources planning. This is a very important initiative that we're working on, and we're hoping that representatives from every state around the country can take away some important information on this very important initiative. Just a few things to go over in this webinar. Some technical items that you should be aware of. The webinar recording and slides will be sent to registered attendees within 2 business days. All webinars are archived on our website, clean-coalition.org, and the Clean Coalition's YouTube channel. There will be a Q&A session with the speakers at the end of their presentations, at the very end of the webinar. If you're interested in having some of your questions answered, please enter them into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll do our very best to get to your questions. If we cannot get to your questions, we'll be sure the speakers will get back to you within a week's time via email. If you have any questions about our webinars, current or future webinars or past, feel free to contact me at josh@clean-coalition.org. So today we have speaking John Bernhardt and Cameron Brooks. John will be speaking first. He is the Outreach Director for the Clean Coalition. He has spent more than a decade working on energy and environmental policy. In particular, he brings extensive knowledge of the evolving electric utility sector with a focus on forward-looking utility programs that effectively capture the benefit of distributed energy resources for system-wide benefit. Cameron is the founder and president of E9 Energy Insight. He also serves as president of Tolerable Planet Enterprises, an advisory firm that provides a unique combination of regulatory engagement, business development, and policy strategy. A seasoned executive, Cameron has deep experience with public policy, capital markets, and electricity regulation that give him a unique ability to craft and lead innovative solutions. If you have any questions, again, technical or otherwise, contact me at josh@clean-coalition.org, and we'll be sure to help you out as best I can. So now I'm going to hand it off to John Bernhardt with his presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Josh, and hopefully you can hear me all right and see my screen. Is that fair to say?
Hear you all right, and we can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks for the introduction, Josh, and thanks to Cameron for joining us for this webinar, and also thanks to everybody taking the time out of their day to attend. So we got about almost a full hour here to really dig into distribution resources planning and some significant trends that we're seeing across the country. So the agenda of what Cameron and I will be speaking about today. So first, distribution resources planning, what is it and why does it matter? Trying to contextualize how this policy is kind of how it first got initiated and how it's starting to evolve across the country. I'm kind of diving into a look at some of those states and how they're going about implementing distribution resource planning in their respective jurisdictions. And then I'll pass it over to Cameron. He's going to give an update on some of the current regulatory trends that he's seeing from proceedings on distribution system planning and grid modernization across the country. And then, as Josh said, we'll have a little time for Q&A at the end. So just real quick, in case people aren't familiar with the Clean Coalition, who we are a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 2009, and we're based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And our mission is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid. And we do that through technical policy and project development expertise. And just to give you a sense for some of the work that we do, we kind of think about it in these 4 major buckets. So analysis and planning, grid modeling and optimization, really investigating distribution systems and understanding how power flows and what sort of opportunities and challenges are presented. Program and policy design, so everything from distribution, grid planning to procurement and interconnection. We were heavy interveners at the California Public Utilities Commission, some other jurisdictions on these topics. And then lastly, community microgrid projects. So looking at specific sections of the grid and optimizing a portfolio of distributed energy resources to come online. And when I say distributed energy resources, which is going to come up throughout this presentation, that refers to local renewable energy like distributed generation, energy storage, electric vehicles, demand response, and energy efficiency. And if somebody's typing in the back, maybe you just mute yourself. Thanks. So jumping right in. So this slide's probably review for most people on this call, but I think it's really useful to start with just an understanding of the basic structure of the power system. And really, since its original construction, over the past decades, up to a century ago, the fundamental design has been the same. It's been electricity generation at remote power plants, traveling over long distance transmission, and then being down converted in voltage at a distribution substation and going out through wooden power poles to serve end use customers. And right now we're really in the midst of a transformational change of this system. And the technologies that are really starting to hit the power system and alter the way in which we generate, manage, and then deliver electricity, they're really all focused, or at least a lot of them are focused on the distribution side. So everything from that distribution substation down and out to end use customers. So think about electric vehicles, distributed generation, any type of demand side management technology, whether it be demand response or energy efficiency. There's a confluence of these technologies really focused on the distribution system. And what's driving this change from kind of a very linear, centralized one-way grid to a much more decentralized, distributed, and integrated grid? And really, the first piece is there's changing economics. And that's really what's driving distributed energy resource adoption. What we're looking at here is just the cost of batteries and solar panels between 2008 and 2018, so over the past decade alone. And we can see that it's been a precipitous decline. In parallel with this decline, we've seen a significant rise in deployment of these resources, particularly solar, and batteries are certainly starting to catch on as well. And these cost declines are, they're really manifesting themselves through projects that we're seeing bid and built and developed across the country. I think this one from Hawaii is fairly notable, in which a cooperative on the island of Kauai signed a deal for a solar plus storage project so they could have essentially dispatchable solar power. That means solar after the sun sets at a blended rate of 11 cents a kilowatt hour. When you look at that in comparison to the average residential electricity prices during that same time, that average residential electricity price was nearly 13 cents a kilowatt hour. So not to say that this project is exactly replicable in every jurisdiction across the country, but we're seeing cost competitiveness manifest itself in a way that is truly unique in driving significant change. And this observation is not unique. A lot of folks in the industry, including utility leaders from across the country, are recognizing that this change is underway. So what we're looking at here this is from Utility Dive's 2018 State of the Electric Utility Report, which surveys nearly 700 electric utility industry professionals. The primary takeaway, the number one takeaway from this survey and the responses that were gathered, was that across the board, utilities are moving both to a cleaner power mix, as well as a much more distributed power mix. And that has to do with the rise in solar, DER, storage. This is a change that's happening, it's underway, and there's a lot of opportunity, really tremendous opportunity to be realized through this, but it's necessitating some changes to how we plan the grid, because it is kind of a new paradigm that's being put forth. So as I said, kind of the distribution grid is really kind of becoming an epicenter of innovation and investment within the power system. But this is essentially what the distribution system looks like for the most part in most utility service territories. It truly is a black box where there's a lack of information available to regulators, legislators, advocates, project developers, people who want to participate in bringing some of these solutions to the grid, thinking creatively and innovatively about new, perhaps better, more cost-effective ways to meet grid needs. There's just a lack of information and access to what is the ability of the existing grid. What does that infrastructure look like? What are the challenges that are coming up? So the point of distribution resources planning is really to break open that black box and to create much more enhanced visibility and knowledge about utility distribution systems. So that kind of sets the stage for why distribution resource planning has come about and why, at least in my view, and in the view of the Clean Coalition, that it's growing in importance as a foundational policy for a smart and cost-effective transition towards a cleaner, more distributed power system. And that's because distribution resource planning supports a number of really important goals. And Pacific Gas and Electric, one of the large investor-owned utilities out in California, really, I think, kind of distilled the goals and their objectives for distribution resource planning quite succinctly, right? It's to modernize the distribution system to accommodate that continued and expected growth of DER and that two-way power flow. Across the board, customers in California and many other states are starting to exert more control and want to participate in their in energy generation and demand response programs, and in being able to plan the distribution system is a key way to enable greater customer choice of new services and technologies. And then the third piece is, really looking not just at a particular customer, but at the system. How can we create a framework that's going to help effectively and proactively identify opportunities in which distributed energy resources may provide the most cost-effective pathway to meeting system needs? So it really kind of touches all of these major areas and objectives. So if that's what distribution resource planning is working towards and trying to achieve, let's talk about what are the actual components of distribution resource planning. And in the Clean Coalition's view, and we've done a lot of work really kind of helping originate and then guide distribution resource planning in California, which is one of the leading states on this topic. It really kind of breaks down to four main components. The first is hosting capacity analysis. The second, location-based methodology to value DER. The third is DRP pilot projects. And then the fourth is DER forecast. So let's spend a little time digging into each of these components. So hosting capacity analysis, this is also referred to sometimes as the integration capacity analysis. They're essentially synonymous, different names for the same thing. But the hosting capacity analysis, in its essence, it's the maximum amount of additional load or generation that can be accommodated within a specific location on the distribution system at a given point in time, without requiring any grid upgrades or adversely impacting safety, power quality, or reliability. So it's an assessment of the capability of the existing distribution system to handle new load or generation. And what we're looking at here is one of the early maps put out by Southern California Edison. The lines in green, red, and yellow are actual pieces. They're parts of SCE's distribution system, particular feeders or segments within those feeders, and it's color-coded based on the available capacity to accommodate new generation. Where does it make sense to site solar, and where does it not make sense to site solar, for example? So hosting capacity analysis, it's a snapshot in time, as I said, that identifies how much room the grid has to accommodate new DER. It's really about how many additional kilowatts or capacity, how much more capacity of generation and or load can be added to a specific node within the distribution grid. And this is coming out of Pacific Gas and Electric's distribution resource planning work, in which you can look at the various DER, whether it be uniform generation, uniform load, various types of solar PV, whether it's fixed, with storage, with a single axis tracker, as well as EVs, because all of these DER have different load and or generation profiles. So looking at those various load profiles in the context of the ability of the grid at a certain point to accommodate new resources, it essentially puts together, as you can see, at what sort of capacity are there very minimal impacts on the grid, and what sort of impacts, or at what sort of capacity might there be some possible impacts on the grid. And proactively getting this information out is really informative, as I'll explain in a little bit more detail later on. So what are the factors that actually impact the results of the hosting capacity analysis? And this is taken from IREC, who's put out an excellent report on hosting capacity analysis. What we're looking at are the major factors. So where is that distributed energy resource going to be sited within the distribution grid? Is it going to be sited next to a substation where the conduit is quite fat and there's a lot of available capacity, or is it going to be sited at the end of a long feeder that's already quite saturated with solar PV? The location itself is going to impact the results of that hosting capacity analysis. The load curve. So what does the load look like on that specific feeder? Is it regular? Is it kind of a residentially driven load? Is it a commercially driven load? Is it a data center where it's relatively flat and consistent high load across the board? Those types of variations will impact hosting capacity analysis. Feeder design. So this is essentially thinking about the physical characteristics in terms of what type of grid equipment is out there. What does the conduit look like? What do the load tap changers look like? What is the configuration that's deployed? And then lastly is the DER technology. As we talked about on the previous slide, different DER will have different load and or generation profiles. So some profiles may fit well within an existing feeder and other profiles may not. So the results of a hosting capacity analysis are essentially the culmination of all of these different factors at play. So that's kind of what hosting capacity analysis is, but what are the use cases for it? What is the application for it? And there's really two primary use cases that are emerging throughout the space, and those are interconnection, the interconnection use case, and then the distribution planning use case. And kind of determining the use case that you're ultimately working towards, trying to determine that use case or use cases early on is kind of critical for guiding what methodology should be employed, what levels of confidence and computational efficiency and granularity are required to achieve the objectives of your desired use case. So for interconnection of DERs, that's essentially being able to proactively map that distribution system, guide projects to locations on the grid where interconnection is going to be quick and cost effective, and then ultimately kind of sync up the interconnection process with that online mapping of the distribution system that can serve as technical screens that right now for most parts of the country are kind of gone through on a reactive one project by one project basis, where somebody develops a project, designs it, and then submits that to the utility for interconnection. This is a way to kind of proactively manage that entire process. On the distribution planning side is thinking about what types of trends in terms of new DER adoption, changes in load, aging equipment, what sort of things are happening on the distribution system, and what do we think might happen in the next 1, 3, 5, 10 years? And how can we start to model some of these expected changes to understand its potential impacts on the distribution system and be able to accommodate and incorporate that information into how we're planning and investing in the distribution system. So where's hosting capacity analysis actually coming into play in the United States? And what we're looking at here is a map of the states that are really truly embarking on this process. So in red here are states where hosting capacity analysis is already underway. So California, Colorado, and Minnesota, where Xcel Energy is based, they're embarking on this process in both of those states in which they operate. New York, through their REV process, is also very proactively going after hosting capacity analysis and proactive mapping of the grid. And there's a variety of states where discussions and activity is underway as well, and those are highlighted in orange. And this is something that even over the past year, we've seen more states kind of come up in color on this map as regulators and utilities themselves start to look at the changes that are happening in the space and realize that this is going to be a foundational piece of kind of grid planning in the future moving forward. And I will just note that not all of the hosting capacity analysis that we're seeing is being driven by regulatory mandate. Here's one example. This is from the city of Fort Collins in Colorado, a municipal utility. They have something known as their SP3 program, or solar power purchase program. It's essentially a feed-in tariff for commercial scale solar. And as part of rolling out that program, they have proactively and voluntarily mapped their distribution grid on a high level, which is what you're looking at here, to identify areas in which their grid does not have available capacity to accommodate new distributed solar. Those areas are in red. Areas where there's limited capacity are highlighted in orange, and then the rest of their service territory that does not have those constraints is highlighted in that beige color. So they've just proactively done this. They've had this information. They realize that this is going to be valuable not only to their customers in the marketplace that are thinking about bringing distributed solar projects on, but it's useful to the utility themselves because they don't want to review interconnection applications that are not going to be viable. So this is a way to direct people to site and bid projects that are based on a location that's attainable for their specific distribution service area. So that's kind of hosting capacity analysis. I'm going to move on to the second piece, which is a methodology to value distributed energy resources. And there's a lot of different categories here in terms of valuation. And if anybody's following kind of valuation around net energy metering, it can be a kind of contentious subject, and there's lots of debates around what should be included, what shouldn't, and how do you quantify that. So not saying that this is an easy process, but just because something isn't easy and straightforward does not mean that it's not worthwhile. And truly starting this discussion around a much more holistic and accurate valuation of distributed energy resources is really quite valuable and going to be very informative and critical to the space moving forward. So the different categories in which you can value DER, we can look at transmission, the ability to avoid transmission capacity costs and line losses. On the distribution side, both avoiding distribution capacity costs, line losses, improved voltage and power quality, increased hosting capacity, the ability to actually expand the flexibility of the distribution grid by bringing particular resources online, reducing O&M costs, and then increasing reliability, resilience, and security. Some of these terms are certainly become buzzwords, have become buzzwords in the industry, but there is a real value with being able to provide some sort of ongoing power in the event of a widespread grid outage. And how exactly that's quantified is, kind of a complex equation, but there is true value to it. And being able to start to set the stage for those conversations and explore what that value might be to specific customers or a utility, this is one mechanism in which to advance that. Generation. So think about energy resource adequacy, ancillary services, and then bringing on flexibility, enhancing the flexibility of the system for greater renewables integration. And then a whole suite of customer, societal, environmental benefits, everything from reduce carbon dioxide emissions, to conserve land, to improve or strengthen local economies through jobs and taxes. There's a whole suite of values here that could be included and kind of up to a particular state to have that discussion about what they deem worth including and how they might quantify that. So the third piece is DRP pilot projects. So really proving out the technical and economic feasibility of distributed energy resources as non-wires alternatives to traditional grid investments. And the Brooklyn Queens substation example here is one that certainly caught a lot of attention throughout the industry, and rightfully so, because it really is quite an impressive example of being able to defer a $1 billion new substation with about $250 million worth of demand response, energy efficiency, distributed generation, some storage. But not every example is going to be maybe quite as headline grabbing as that, but there are a lot of examples out there in which utilities are starting to see some constraints within portions of their distribution systems and the ability to kind of think creatively and then deploy resources to test out their ability to defer or potentially avoid those grid needs is kind of a key part in moving this conversation forward and moving this transition forward. And distribution resources planning is a kind of an excellent way to kind of guide and house and learn from those pilot projects. And then the fourth piece is DER and load forecast. So the grid is certainly not static. It hasn't been in the past, it's not now in the present, and won't be in the future. So how do we start to incorporate some of the dynamic nature of the grid, particularly with the rise in deployment of distributed energy resources, into a planning discussion that's going to help guide smart investments in the grid moving forward? So thinking about where DER growth is expected, not only in terms of quantity, but perhaps based on locations, given customer trends, and what the utility may be seeing to date, as well as where is load expected to grow, where are population pockets expanding, and how does this come together to inform what will be kind of a comprehensive and thoughtful way to manage, invest in, and run a distribution system. And then also these forecasts can inform the hosting capacity analysis for the distribution planning use case, which I talked about briefly, but being able to bring in some of these projections and kind of well-vetted projections and simulate that. What will that look like in terms of its impacts on the distribution system? Where are there going to be issues that crop up, and how do we kind of incorporate our planning today to accommodate for those expected changes that we might see? So those are the kind of the four major components of distribution resource planning. Let's talk a bit about what are the benefits of implementing distribution resource planning. And what I have here is quoted from the chair of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, who I thought she summed this up just better than I could. The main takeaways are it's kind of maintaining and enhancing the safety and reliability and security of the grid in alignment with state energy policies. It's ensuring optimized utilization of grid assets, increasing transparency, evaluating efficient non-wires alternatives. A lot of these goals, which are, I think, very unobjectionable and very worthy goals, are being pursued and achieved through distribution resource planning. So I'm going to start to move quick here because I want to save some time for Cameron. A couple other benefits is streamlining interconnection of DER. Is by providing that information proactively, you're going to guide projects to be sited at locations on the grid where the grid can accommodate that new resource. And then another huge piece is being able to save ratepayers money by avoiding transmission. So in California, we've seen more than a dozen transmission projects canceled due to energy efficiency and rooftop solar coming online, just eliminating that need for expanding that transmission capacity. There's huge value in this and being able to kind of proactively think about how distribution planning and the guiding of resources on the distribution side can have significant and quantifiable benefits on the transmission planning side, and the interplay between distribution and transmission planning. And just very quickly, the need for cost-effective DER is growing because what we're looking at here is transmission investments since 1996. And investment in transmission is growing substantially. There's huge costs that ratepayers foot the bill for. So ultimately, DRP improves system planning processes by looking more holistically at the grid to identify the best solution. And Mark Scara here of PG&E, instead of looking strictly at wire solutions, they looked at DERs as non-wire solutions to really understand what the grid needed and what the best, most cost-effective solution was going to be that ensured reliability, safety, and affordability. So just a quick snapshot here of state activities on distribution grid planning, and I'll be brief because I know Cameron's going to touch on this in more detail. There's a lot of activity underway is the headline, and states are taking various approaches. Some are kind of voluntary at this point, some have been legislatively mandated, some have been regulatorily mandated. So there's a lot of examples out there. So if you're a state that's looking at this policy, not quite sure how you want to approach it, there are a lot of lessons out there and a lot of states to look to in terms of what they're thinking and framing an approach is. And then lastly, Clean Coalition, we're here, we're ready to help. We certainly see the instrumental value in this policy. We believe it is going to become a ubiquitous policy across the country. And given our experience in California, we're happy to share lessons learned from what we're seeing both there, some work we've done in Colorado, as well as our tracking across the country. So with that, Josh, I'll let you pass the mic and the screen over to Cameron.
Well, good morning or good afternoon. Let me just, is my screen up and running there?
It is, Cameron. Thanks a lot. It looks good, and we can hear you great.
Perfect. Well, thanks. It's great to be here and to be part of the discussion. And, as John has pointed out, it's a really timely one. So I just wanted to maybe dive in a little bit more on what some of the states are doing. And at the risk of maybe starting out a little policy wonky, I think it's perhaps worth calling out just a larger context around distribution planning, because I think it says something about why is this important now. So there's a simple truth that is, I think, well known but frequently overlooked, which is the degree to which energy markets are designed by regulators. So in other industries, we're used to somehow the market arising somewhat organically. But that's really not the case with electricity, and market structure is so dependent on policy decisions. And really markets, as John sort of pointed out before, they rely very much on how information flows and the level of transparency. And so addressing this black box, as he described it, is one that's particularly important as that line between the utility and the customer gets increasingly blurred. I bring this up mostly because in my experience, commissions and commissioners take very seriously their role as economic regulators, and not necessarily as ideologues for a particular market model. So this rise of distribution planning, as the title suggests, is coming in large part because technology, and through technology, consumers are changing what options constitute what is the least cost and most reliable solution. So for me, a great example of this comes from the early stages of the REV in New York, where the commission, as they kicked off this famous or perhaps infamous, depending on where you sit, I suppose, process, explicitly declared, if not for the first time, then at least for one of the first times that I've seen in commission speak, we believe as a commission that the least cost solution relies on challenging some core assumptions, and especially a core assumption around what is the role of the consumer and where do we find economies of scale. So very briefly, E9 Insight is a regulatory research firm. We track the activities of state public utility commissions, provide some tailored research, and really are looking to help our clients and others engage in this policymaking process by getting a bit more experience and understanding. Our clients tend to span technology companies providing some solution or hardware into the utility industry, or advocates that are pushing forward some kind of policy agenda, and to some degree government agencies and national labs as they're providing technical assistance on the state side. We call it E9 just because we cover and organize these activities into 9 different topic areas that focus on the distribution side or the edge of the grid, and how business models are evolving to accommodate new technologies. And while we focus on the commissions primarily, we're also very aware that there isn't just one kind of utility. So we tend to organize the market into 6 classes of utilities based here on, or proportioned here on, retail revenue. So you can see the relative size of the investor-owned entities on the top and the public utilities on the bottom. You know, I may come back to this. And I would say anyone who spent any time looking at the regulatory landscape in the US will quickly realize that each state is completely unique. And while they can be completely unique, they can also be organized into what I'll call families that have common characteristics. So some of you may have seen this before, but we use a tool that borrows from the physical sciences, the periodic table, where much like the elements themselves, each state has unique qualities, but sits within a more regional context. And I'm going to sort of use this throughout the presentation. So I wanted to just kind of touch on how this is organized. And so there's 10 different families that roughly correspond to the geographic and market structure regions around the country. So each column here is a family, with the larger states on top, the smaller on the bottom. You can see these then again represented on the map here. As I said, the larger states are on top, the smaller ones are on the bottom. So for those of you keeping score at home or digging up your high school chemistry memories, so that's different than the actual periodic table. And one thing to note is that as you move from left to right, you move generally from more vertically integrated markets to those markets that have gone through some kind of restructuring or have retail competition. And of course, the picture gets a little bit more complicated. You can see states here in blue that have a competitive market on the wholesale side, but regulated retail rates on the retail side. It's also useful to see things like how the commissions are structured, like how commissions are either appointed or elected. So in terms of distribution system planning, you know, one of the things that I certainly see and that we reveal in some of the research as we're monitoring is kind of how distribution system planning is arising or manifesting within the different states. So I wanted to just walk through couple different categories. So the first is really just states that have some kind of explicit focus or explicit initiative related to distribution resource planning. And you've heard of these before in California, New York, Hawaii, more recently Nevada that passed some legislation last year. But many states are approaching this question of distribution planning through the context of grid modernization, which, you know, we're looking at quite broadly, but is a larger effort at looking at how new investments in distribution technology can be coupled with some notion of open access to the grid for consumer technologies, consumer resources, regardless of whether it's on the utility side of the meter or the customer side. Everyone's got their own definition, but a few common characteristics, I think, revolve around this idea of either open access, some sense of grid neutrality, and open access to information. So you'll see here a few states where I think there are broader policy initiatives that are incorporating distribution planning into this broader context, and so it's becoming very relevant there. Finally, I guess I would say that there are some states that are, in a sense, backing into the question of distribution system planning, either because it's a response to a capital investment proposal from a utility where the commission might stop and say, well, before we can address this from a matter of prudence, you know, we want to look at, in a more systematic way, what's your overall plan for the distribution system? Or similarly, related to tariff proposals, whether that's net metering or value of solar or value of storage. something along those lines, where, again, commissioners may be hitting some kind of pause button and say, let's look at this in a slightly broader context. So, I've highlighted a few states here that I think have some interesting activity in that regard. And then I would say, finally, there are maybe a few states that we might want to highlight because perhaps there might be some activity that is coming soon. So you'll see those here in the periodic table in gray. Florida more recently, as I'm sure many of you know, had a decision allowing third-party financing, which I think may dramatically increase the impact of solar within the state, ironically, in the Sunshine State. In North Carolina, the topic of planning at the distribution level has been an advocate interest for quite a long time, but hasn't necessarily found purchase yet. I think there's a few Western states that are probably going to be facing more and more distributed energy and especially rooftop solar impacts, and where there's some organized advocacy interest around this. So I could kind of walk through each of these, but I wanted to touch on just some notable activity, really even over the last month or so. As I mentioned before, there was a decision in Florida that I think could have some big impact. Last month in Minnesota, the IOUs filed plans related to distribution planning, and Excel has published some hosting capacity maps. Washington State issued some draft rules last month that are comment. The Michigan Public Service Commission issued an order requiring distribution plans to be filed in the near future. Massachusetts I guess I jumped over DC, where there's some proposed legislation that would create a new distributed energy resource authority, which is kind of an interesting model. Massachusetts, after almost a year of silence, issued a decision on grid modernization that some might see as a little bit dispiriting in this larger context. I might say it's perhaps emblematic of a tension that doesn't bode well for grid modernization investments that have promising benefits, but that might be difficult to quantify precisely. The commission there, the Department of Public Utilities, largely rejected proposals to implement AMI, advanced meters, smart meters. So it's sort of, I guess maybe the grid modernization hill got a little bit steeper to climb there if some of the things like basic functionality around better information about usage becomes a real challenge to get implemented. And finally, New Hampshire issued an order focused on the locational value of distributed energy. So stepping back maybe for a moment, just to make a couple of little highlights. I mentioned Michigan issued an order. There's a quote here. I know these slides will be available afterwards. But I think it's important just kind of to see how commissions are really looking, consistent with what John said, in terms of broader trends, and how do we incorporate these new technologies, demand response, things that we expect to be coming soon. As I mentioned before, Washington issued some draft rules that, again, are focused in response, perhaps, largely to technological advances. As has been noted in a few different places, Rhode Island has one of the more ambitious power sector transformation initiatives underway right now, where they're bringing in many different departments of the state and trying to look holistically, and distribution system planning is clearly critical within all of that. And finally, at a more global level, or at least national level, NARUC, the organization for the state commissioners, has published earlier this year a primer, and it really builds off of a manual that they put out about a year and a half ago, looking at distributed energy resource compensation and highlighting sort of different stages of market development. And I think many of the states, remain in some of these early stages where there's low adoption, but perhaps high forecast for adoption. One interesting model that I wanted to highlight that I think may end up having some elements of this that get incorporated in a best practices is a proposal from HECO in Hawaii. The charts you can find in the report. Clearly, they're sort of too complicated to get into here in terms of flow diagrams. But I guess what I would say is ultimately what they're trying to do, or what they have proposed to do, is that rather than walk through an administrative process that's going to define the value of resources at different points along their network, they are trying to incorporate some earlier market feedback through RFIs and RFPs that essentially get baked into an iterative planning process. I think it's a very interesting model, and I think it's one of the more, it's a place where I think a state is kind of pushing forward to really incorporate the information that's available from market participants, and perhaps only through market participants as opposed to just from the administrative side. Related to that is what I see as a innovative approach around taking this concept of the static hosting capacity, which is really based on kind of a worst case scenario violation, if you will, and trying to figure out how can that become a more dynamic view, both based on location and on timing, so that maybe you can get connected to things like distributed storage that can help overcome certain capacity constraints. Now, in full disclosure, I actually work with Opus One Solutions. My role with E9 is part-time as founder, but I've got a great team here of people, so hopefully if you get a chance, you'll have an opportunity to be in touch with Sam or Christina, who do a lot of the day-to-day research. But I just wanted to highlight the idea of moving towards this dynamic hosting capacity. Again, I think Hawaii, by force of the conditions that they're in, has an opportunity to really work on that. Going back to just some of the view of the entire country, as I noted before, there isn't necessarily a lot of visible activity in the states that cover some of the southern and plains areas. As you get up into Minnesota and the western states, there's more going on, especially in California, which can be in some respects its own nation state. And across the Midwest and New England, there's a bit more coordinated activity, largely related to grid modernization. I mean, there are some states within all of this that I think have some larger gravitational pull, which is probably why they get a lot of attention. I mean, the 6 largest states that have revenues over 15 billion account for about 40% of the overall market. So one state in particular that I think is going to be interesting to watch is Ohio, where the commission, after a year or so of holding listening sessions, is in the process of writing up their conclusions and recommendations, where I think there may be an interesting opportunity to start considering things like an open access distribution tariff, pulling from a model that's familiar in the bulk power markets, but without the complete market reform as outlined in states like New York, or without the aggressive distributed energy policies in a state like California. But from a kind of an overall grid planning point of view, I think part of what is notable is the level of activity in the states that have a bit more of a competitive flair. I think it's probably safe or fair to observe that many of the utilities that show up in the left on the periodic table, where there doesn't appear to be much activity, and I think those utilities would probably say this kind of planning is actually happening and perhaps being shared with the commission, but it's not through a formalized process, which is probably reflective of the overall utility commission relationship in those regions, and that have historically embraced vertical integration models and don't likely look like they're going to be moving away from it anytime soon. And so, so I think for a solid third of the country, what you're likely to see are distribution planning led by utilities and used really to inform capital investment plans in the distribution system, and that may provide new products and services to consumers, but largely through a vertically integrated context. So what we've termed here the internal platform, and where ownership and market offerings are really going to be dominated by the existing utilities. Excuse me. Then there's a little bit in the middle, some states that might kind of get pulled one way or another. But then I think on the other side, there are states that are more inclined towards open markets, perhaps even this notion of grid neutrality, and where I think there's going to be an inclination to create more market mechanisms to support new entrants, aggregators, third-party financiers, community ownership models. And as I say, I think there's a little bit of a question, some states that potentially might get pulled one way or another, or may, chart something of a different path. So just a couple of closing thoughts. There's quite a bit of activity, as I've noted here, in at least 17 states that represent about 40% of the overall market. Personally, I see a lot of this as an inevitable outcome of advances in consumer technology, and that raise questions around where the boundary is between the utility and what the boundary of, I guess, the utility franchise really is. I think implementation and best practices is critical, and just, in terms of snapshots, a lot of utilities are developing hosting capacity using tools like EPRI's Drive tool. But I think that's also come under some critique as being perhaps something where it's hard to understand the underlying methodology and the inputs that go in. So I think for generating the kind of buy-in from stakeholders, many states are really explicitly calling out this needs to be a stakeholder process, and perhaps looking more critically at those tools that are being used to determine, are those tools providing enough transparency around what the methodology is, not just what the answer is, to really make for a robust policy going forward. Finally, there's some element that I think is also interesting to look at, which is the degree to which the bulk power system and ISOs are asking for more information. And returning perhaps to the idea at the beginning, this question of planning, really, whether they're recognizing it or not, and I think most are, I think the commissions and commissioners are, in essence, looking at how do we redesign new markets, not just utility business models, but what do we want the overall market design structure to look like? And so this idea of distribution planning is really a first step. So I pulled just a quote from a recent presentation about, if you're going to build something, the first tool you're going to want to pick up is a pencil. And I think that's what we're seeing happening across a lot of the states. So with that, we may have a couple minutes for some questions. I thank you and look forward to talking more.
Thank you, Cameron. We're going to go for the quick Q&A, and I just want to put up John's and Cameron's contact information while we do that. Thank you, John. All right, so you guys can field these questions as you see fit. So I'm going to ask them, and whoever wants to answer can do so. This one comes from Van Rainey from the East Bay Clean Power Alliance. And Van states, I attended a forum last week on microgrids and learned about an effort by UC Berkeley. In that, UCB was confronted by a utility network that was evidently very complicated, so much that they could not borrow wiring from the network to connect the buildings in the planned microgrid. His question is, how can we have the existing grid owners facilitate sharing of the network?
Well, I guess I'll jump in on that. I mean, that's obviously a question that ultimately becomes a question for policymakers. I think the idea of distribution resource planning can help bring some transparency as to what's possible. But there's a lot of implications about, what the best ways to make those wires available are. And I would say different commissions take have different opinions on whether those are really utility, privately owned, regulated assets, or whether they take more of a public infrastructure view on them, and really sort of drive that open access. But I don't know enough about the specific situation in Berkeley or those microgrids to comment specifically on that.
Great, thank you, Cameron. The next question comes from RJ Harrington. He's the Director of Business Development and National Card Charging. RJ states, intriguing that there may be uniform load limits. And he asks, one would imagine that uniform load from a storage bank would be a boon to most distribution grids? That's a question.
Yeah, I can jump in there, and I think kind of the main takeaway is that every substation area and feeder and section of that feeder is likely to be somewhat unique. So depending, I think, on the constraints of the grid, if they exist, obviously additional load could be quite valuable for perhaps expanding hosting capacity and the ability to accommodate more local generation. But I suppose that's assuming that that substation or that feeder is not already being pushed to its max capacity, in which additional load is going to push it over that threshold. So it's a good question, and I think folks are starting to ask questions like that when it comes to the desire to connect additional distributed solar or EVs or EV charging infrastructure and deploying that. Where is this going to make the most sense? Where is the profile of this particular equipment going to best mesh with the ability of the grid to handle that additional load or generation?
Great, thank you, John, for that answer. The next question comes from David Woolley. He's the director of the Goldman School Center for Environmental Public Policy at Berkeley. David states, am I right that the hosting capacity analysis also allows the distribution grid operator to identify areas where distributed storage and targeted DER could relieve distribution or transmission constraints and losses?
So David, I'll jump in on that first, and congratulations on what sounds like a new position. I think the proof is in the pudding a little bit on that. And while I am not a power flow expert, I think what I have seen and what I have heard from many who are more actively involved is that the hosting capacity analysis, certainly in theory, is supposed to be able to start moving exactly towards being able to identify those kinds of constraints where some kind of non-wires alternative, whether it's storage or some other technology, or perhaps even more innovative interconnection agreements that might, allow voluntary curtailing of resources so that we don't have those problems. That's certainly the kind of stuff, those solutions are the kinds of things that should be revealed. I'm not sure that the hosting capacity analysis, as they're being generated right now, are detailed enough to be able to actually be used for that kind of identification certainly by external parties. So that's a critique that I see frequently raised, but again, I leave sort of the details of that to others who've got more technical abilities to comment on whether or not that granularity, what level of granularity is required in order to generate those kinds of solutions.
Yep, and I think I agree with pretty much everything Cameron said there, is that the way hosting capacity analysis is playing out, it's a new process in evolution that, exactly as Cameron said, I think people are starting to figure out what might be missing or how can we improve the methodologies to achieve kind of the certainty of the outcomes that we want. So I know California is in the midst of going to kind of much more granular detail for all of their feeders around hourly load profiles for the peak and minimum day for each month of the year. And it's an iterative process as stakeholders come to the table. They're understanding what data they've gotten that's useful, and then what pieces are missing, and how can we further refine this process so we're getting the optimal value out of it for the use cases, like you said.
Thanks, guys. And I think we have time for one more. This comes from Edward Mainland. He's the co-president and secretary of Sustainable Novato in California and the co-chair of the Energy Climate Committee for the Sierra Club in California. And I think, John, you can take this one if you can. He asked, what happened to the feed-in tariffs and the clean coalition's espousal thereof in context of DRP?
Yeah, well, I would say, the Clean Coalition, for background, in case people don't know, we were originally founded in 2009 as the Feed-in Tariff Coalition. We saw a huge opportunity to expand cost-effective local renewable generation by focusing on wholesale distributed generation projects. So, net metering has been a very successful policy for driving behind the meter retail distributed generation. RPS policies have really driven centralized, transmission connected renewable energy projects, but there's a sweet spot that was missing. And we continue to be very active in working with utilities, municipalities, CCAs to evaluate and design feed-in tariffs to kind of unlock that underserved market segment. In distribution resource planning, we've evolved as an organization, have expanded scope, but this is very much in alignment and supportive of that broader vision of greater transparency into distribution networks, understanding where there may be real opportunities to quickly interconnect and where that's going to be cheap, because that's been a huge problem for wholesale distributed generation projects in California and elsewhere. And then also thinking about, through this process of uncovering and identifying perhaps substation areas that are starting to be stressed, how do we bring on and procure a suite or a portfolio of distributed energy resources that might be able to most effectively meet that grid need? In our view, wholesale distributed generation can play a real meaningful part in that discussion.
Thank you, John. I knew you had a thorough answer for that question. And that concludes our webinar. And if you look at my screen, I should thank John and Cameron for participating. Great job, guys. And if anyone is interested in downloading both of their presentations or viewing them, they will be on our website and sent out via email within the next day. And the recording of the webinar will also be on our website during that time. If you look at my screen, you will see our page on our Distribution Resources Planning Initiative. You get there by going to clean-coalition.org, our work, and distribution resources planning, and it has a chock full of information on the work that we've been doing on this important initiative. Upcoming webinars, I should show you those. We have another one on May 24th, which is next week, continuation of our webinar series on the North Bay Community Resilience Initiative. You can register on our website for that. And then on June 5th, Streamlining the Interconnection of Advanced Energy Solutions to the Grid. That's the latest webinar from our Peninsula Advanced Energy Community Initiative. And we're going to be announcing 2 more webinars for mid to late June, so look out for those. And thanks very much, John and Cameron, again, and thank you everybody for attending. We'll see you next time.